Good morning. Representative Bear,
Here.
Representative Byron,
Here.
Representative Locke, Representative Northrup,
Here.
Representative Oakley,
Here.
Representative Storer,
She's here. She's excused, but she's here.
Representative Strock,
She also is here with us, but excused.
and mark her excused, or just wait.
Go ahead and keep it open. Keep that
Okay.
roll open.
All right, sir.
Folks who are watching online, they're here. They were in our trainings with us this morning.
All right.
So
We'll just hear it off.
we're good. Okay,
Uh,
very good. Well,
Representative Zwanitzer,
I'm still here too.
Chairman Harshman. Gotcha. Thank you.
okay, thank you very much. And and looks, as I look in the audience, so how we're gonna do online testimony, we'll do that after folks in the room testify. And then, as time allows, we have potentially 4 bills to hear. And looking out on this crowd, everyone's pretty veteran. We appreciate you being here, and all conversation goes through the chairman, so we don't get back and forth between folks who are testifying and individual members or between members, et cetera. So again, we appreciate you here and move forward to that. So we're gonna first take on the sales tax holiday bill, I'm calling it. It's actually House Bill 71, sales tax holiday for back to school. Then we'll move to the revisions bill by Representative Brown, then marriage licenses, and then as time allows, the LSRA. So if you're here for the LSRA bill, you can probably head out and come on back later. And I don't think anyone's here for that bill. So, okay, so with that, we have House Bill 71 is on the table. And Representative Brown, welcome to the committee, and we'd love to hear your explanation of the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First time I've ever been in front of the Revenue Committee, so this is a new one for me. But Mr. Chairman, I bring you House Bill 71, and frankly, it's a pretty simple bill, Mr. Chairman. What this bill does is, this was a constituent bill. I had a constituent that was traveling down to Texas in August and contacted me via text message and said, why doesn't Wyoming do something like this? And he sent me a picture of a Macy's sign, and the sign said, back to school, no sales tax. And so it was a reduction to them down in Texas of like 7.5%, something along those lines. And kind of got to talking and having the discussion with him. He says, well, I'd really think that this would be something that the Wyoming citizenry would be interested in having. And you know, if we just do it for a weekend or 2 weeks, whatever you think you might be able to do, this is what we think would be a great idea. And so put the bill in. And actually what I found out is after I put this bill in, it was actually kind of a regurgitation of a bill that was brought by Representative Zwanitzer back in 2012. So it's been about 10 years since this bill has seen life. And it did not make it back then, unfortunately, but I do think that it's worth having the discussion on here for. Really, Mr. Chairman, it's a pretty simple bill. What we do is we just exempt sales tax on school supplies. So this wouldn't apply to cars or anything of major purchase. And if you read through the bill, I can certainly go through that with you, but exempts the sales tax on most of the back to school supplies out there. And it applies it for a single weekend in August, right before school gets into session. And it's a minimal impact to the state. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to go ahead and bring it. I was looking at this and I thought, you know, looking at 1.6 million, it doesn't seem like it's that much to the state. But honestly, when you look at what that means to a family of 4 or family of 5 with 3 kids, that's a substantial amount of money that they get to keep in their pocket. And I do think that you'd see a lot of people taking advantage of this. So, Mr. Chairman, it's a pretty simple bill. I don't feel the need to really go in depth in this. I would stand for more questions. I think would probably be the better use of time.
Okay, members, any questions? Representative Locke.
Yes, just, is there any additional administration to actually implement this and manage this? What other costs are induced based on implementing this program? And then managing this, I believe it's roughly one weekend, right? So 1 3-day weekend.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Locke, that's a great question, and I appreciate that because that is one of the concerns that I had as well. And what I would say is there are 16 other states that have a very similar tax holiday, and then there's an additional 10 beyond that that have an extension. And so I'm not against to expanding this and having this for more than 3 days. I think that would be a great opportunity. But what I would say is that some other states have figured this out and they've worked with their retailers and they've figured out how to make this happen. So there is going to be a cost associated with the Department of Revenue, specifically probably working with the retailers and the vendors to make sure that things are exempted correctly. But I do think that if we push this forward, I don't think it's something that can be overcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. Other questions? Just a question, you mentioned Texas as an example. What's their sales tax rate?
Mr. Chairman, I am not positive what their sales tax rate. I do know that it varies by county as well, similar to ours. The county that was where this came from was like 7.5% at that particular location, but I don't know what the statewide sales tax is on them.
How many services does Texas tax?
Mr. Chairman, that's also outside of my range of knowledge.
A little over 200.
Okay, thank you, Mr.
We
Chairman.
tax about 50, under 60. Not that I'm talking about your next bill. But I think that, you know, they're a non-income tax state similar to us, but a very different sales tax and a very different property tax state than us, much higher. Okay, any other questions or comments? Representative Northrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative, can you tell me whether or not, I'm sorry, can you tell me whether or not this includes online purchases?
Go ahead,
Thank you, Mr.
Representative Brown.
Mr. Chairman, as it stands, it would. Representative Northrup, this would apply to online purchases, and that would also be something that the Department of Revenue as well as the retailers would have to work out.
Okay, very good. Any other? Representative Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative, can you tell me what you expect as far as the retailers, the complexity that they're going to have to deal with, and any risks that they might be incurring as far as an audit in the future for this type of an exemption?
Go ahead, Representative Brown.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Bear, I think a very similar question to what Representative Locke looked at. And I think there is complexity in this issue, right? When you look at the page 2 and page 3, and even into page 4, we've got all those exemptions and how things are applied. Again, I can't speak to it specifically. I think that would be something that the Department of Revenue would probably have a little bit more information on as far as the auditing side of things goes. But what I will also say is, again, that 16 other states have a very, very similar program in place, and they figured out a way to work with their retailers. So my suspicion is, especially the larger retailers that would have this impact, the majority of them would have this, already have a solution to this. I don't think it's going to be a major problem, but I'm also not under, any circumstances that I think that we're not going to have unforeseen issues with it as well.
Okay, thank you. Representative Storr has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Brown, can you tell me what the average you think will save Wyoming families with this bill?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I don't know that I have an average per se on this, but when you figure the average sales tax across the state is right around that 4.5%, 4.75%, I think it's safe to say you're talking a couple $100 that's going to be saved by each individual family in the month of August. And when you figure that's, a couple tanks of gas, could be a couple dinners, couple loads of groceries, it's a substantial amount of money. But again, $1.6 million to the state, not a huge deal. But at the end of the day, what that 1.6 million means to the individual families is a far greater impact, in my opinion.
Mr. Chairman, follow up?
Representative Storr, follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just looking at the fiscal note that says average about $600 per student. So if that's times 4%, isn't that about $24?
Yeah, and I think our average statewide is 5.34 or something
So
similar
let's
to
say
that.
$30, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, that sounds
Yeah.
about right. And then when you're looking at the $24 per student, if you got a family of 2 or 3 students going in there, you're talking $100. And again, not a substantial savings, but it is something that when we look at, frankly, when I look at what we're banking this year with almost $1 billion in surplus, one of the things that I look at is, what does that mean to our citizens? And right now, the citizenry is saying, wow, you guys are banking $1 billion. I'm still paying all my taxes. And so leaning back on that, a 1.6 million is not a substantial hit to our state's budget, but it is a substantial impact to our budget for our individual students. And again, I would also point Mr. Chairman on this, that the fiscal note it's an estimate. When you look at, just an individual laptop for a senior in high school, or a college freshman going back, we exempted at $1,500, but $1,500, that blows the $600 estimate out of the water just with one laptop purchase. So there is a substantial opportunity here for families.
Representative Oakley has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Brown, this might be a question for the Department of Revenue, but do you think if there was an exclusion for online purchases, that would ease the administration, either difficulties or cost?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I don't venture to guess on that, to be honest with you. I would ask the Department of Revenue to weigh in on that. They would certainly know their processes a lot better than I do.
Okay, any other questions? Representative Bear. We're gonna,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative, the local source fund, is your expectation that the local communities would contribute their part of this as well
Mr. Chairman,
on the sales tax?
so this
Any
would just,
portion that would go to the local community?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Bear, this would just be a complete exemption on that. So there would be a hit to our locals. They would not have anything to necessarily contribute, as you stated, but it would be a hit to their ultimate funding. It would be, I would venture to guess, fairly minimal across 23 counties and 99 municipalities.
Thank you.
okay. Representative Block, another question?
And you'd mentioned that you guys had looked into possibly extending it. So for example, make it a week, something like that. Have you looked into that?
Go ahead, Representative Brown.
Mr. Chairman,
Thank you,
Representative
Mr.
Blunt.
Chairman.
Yes, I did look into that. Once the fiscal note came back on my very first draft of this, it was after a week, and I recognized that that's not probably what I wanted to go with. That put it up over about $10 million. And I think that the way that many of the other states that I looked through NCSL and CSG, a couple of our partner organizations that we utilize, and the majority of them do run this, 1 weekend. And I think that that's a sufficient amount of time. We'll see in the next bill that there's some other opportunities for us to look at changing our tax structure and adjusting things. But as it stands right now, I'm not married to the 3-day weekend, but I certainly am open to amendments.
Thank you, Mr.
Very
Chairman.
good.
Thank you, Mr.
I think we'll move now. Thank you. And Representative Brown, Department of Revenue, you have any comments on the bill? Some questions about administration and thank you, Representative Brown. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Brett Fanning. I'm the Excise Tax Administrator here at the Wyoming Department of Revenue. And so just in hearing some of the conversation, it sounds like the Department of Revenue has a lot of questions here. And that's why I'm here to answer those, Mr. Chairman. If I could, I did write down some of these questions that maybe I may be able to shed some light on. The first one was related to kind of the administration. How does this all work? And so in a previous taxation role that I had with the Wyoming, state of Wyoming, I was an auditor, and now I'm in the tax administration portion of it. And so with this sales tax holiday, the burden, I hate to use that word, but it is true, this exemption would fall upon the retailers. And so what happens here is that for a weekend, for a specific weekend, the retailers in their point of sale system, what they would do is that they would temporarily exempt these items that are outlined in this bill. And then later on, a few days later, they would have to remember or have programming to actually institute that taxation back in play. And so this one is at the retailer level. So as far as my fiscal note, the figures that I came up with, this falls upon the retailers. I did receive several questions about would families have to provide exemption certificates. And that's a way in the state of Wyoming we exempt purchases. For this particular bill, that is not the case. So these items, we call these a product-based exemption. These are the ones that would be exempt and would be up to the retailers to temporarily exempt these. Now, I know from my experience in working with hundreds of companies throughout the state of Wyoming that sometimes this can be difficult. It can, but that being said, the department doesn't have a position on this bill per se, but I do know that sometimes this can be very difficult. The department at times has complications in getting them to properly tax things throughout the whole year. And that's kind of the feedback I've received once this bill became public, was that at the retailer level, you said it's likely going to be on us. How does that administration piece work? Now, I'm not saying this can't be done, but it is at the retailer level. Administration-wise, the Department of Revenue has very little to do with this piece of it. On those sales tax holidays, it's at the retailer level who would be responsible for programming those and coding it properly in their system. And then at the end of the weekend, making sure they're properly coded again to make sure. So that's the tax administration portion of it. The Department of Revenue has very little as far as that aspect.
Any questions? Okay, very good. Appreciate you being here this morning.
Okay.
Okay, and then just any comments? I guess our average state sales tax is it that 5.3 with the locals and the state 4%? Do you know that number?
Mr. Chairman, yes, that is correct. It is currently at 5.3. That's the average of all of our 23
All
counties.
this. How about Texas? Do you know theirs? I was just spouting off. I want to make sure I was.
Mr. Chairman, yes, Texas is significantly higher than us. It is in the 7-ish around the state rate. And then as Representative Brown said, each additional county can tack on, just like we do here in Wyoming.
So their average is over 7%.
Yes, they have, Mr. Chairman, yes, they have a higher sales tax rate than we do at the state level.
Okay, members, any questions? Mr. Fanning? Okay, Representative Locke and Representative Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You'd mentioned that the weight of the making this happen is on the retailers. Has there been any feedback that says this is too difficult or it's not too difficult? I'm just curious what their reaction is, because I must confess I haven't been able to feel that pulse as well.
Yeah,
So
go ahead, Mr. Fanning.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Locke, yes, I'm actually very familiar with sales tax holidays, even though we don't have them here in the state of Wyoming. I am involved in several organizations that represent states that do. And so, yes, there are over a dozen states that have sales tax holidays. Now, that being said, Wyoming is part of the Streamlined Sales Tax Agreement. And so there are a couple states in the same organization that the state of Wyoming is that have sales tax holidays. And so those states have been able to put in statutes that allow them to be compliant with the Streamlined Sales Tax Agreement. And again, in those states as well, the burden does, and I hesitate to use that word, but the retailers are responsible for administering those exemptions, and it can be difficult. And that is the feedback that we've heard. Now, again, it's kind of this dance where you've got these retailers that are responsible for the programming, updating their system, making sure to change it back. But then on the other side of the coin, you have families who maybe have a tax savings. And so again, that's a policy decision for this body to make, but there are states that do it. And so there are 45 states that have sales tax. And so less than half of those have sales tax holidays. And then even a smaller amount actually in the Streamlined Sales Tax Agreement have these holidays because they can be difficult to administer at the retailer level. And then also with the passage of this bill, there's some complexities on if you're still compliant with the Streamlined Sales Tax Agreement.
That's a good question. Okay, Representative Bear has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I guess mine's going to be somewhat similar. This is a program that a retailer is completely free to not impose or not be a part of. Is that right, the way this is written?
I think, yeah, if we pass the law, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, if this legislation does pass, everyone has to follow the same rules. They would not be able to opt out. And that is an integral part of this, is that they do not have a choice.
Yeah, we changed the law. Go ahead,
Well,
Representative Bear.
And so if that's the case, then I had asked earlier about auditing. You said that, Mr. Fanning, you've been in the audit department before. You know, what does that look like for a retailer? You mentioned also that they tend to forget to come off of those exemptions for those particular products. What does that look like for them as far as an audit, the opportunity for an audit, and what's maybe the grace that they might see from your department?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Bear, yes, there would be a potential liability there to the retailers. I do know from past experiences that, yes, retailers, although they are very, very good and very, very compliant, it can sometimes be tough to program your system and then have those safeguards and checks and balances in place so that when this sales tax holiday does end, they do not have future liability. Now, again, the Department of Revenue and the Department of Audit here in the state of Wyoming, so we're two separate agencies, but the Department of Revenue is the administrative agency for the Department of Audit. And so our general guidance is if there is an untaxed sale and there is not supporting documentation, that would be considered an audit exception.
Good. Representative Oakley, and then we're rounding this up here shortly. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Have you seen an opt-out program in any other state? And what are your thoughts? Why couldn't we put in an opt-out provision?
Go ahead, Mr. Fanning.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Oakley, outstanding question. And the reason there is, so we are part of the streamlined sales tax agreement, and having some sort of opt-out would put us out of compliance with the streamlined sales tax agreement. And so for those folks who are not familiar with the streamlined sales tax agreement, Wyoming's part of it. It is in, let's see, it is in our statutes, 3915-107. That's the statute that you can find where Wyoming is part of the streamlined sales tax agreement. And this is an association of 24 states that is geared towards making sales tax compliance easier across state lines. There's 24 states involved, and as being in that agreement, there are certain strings attached. And so one of those is if it's taxable in your state, it's got to be taxable everywhere. And if it's not taxable in your state, it's not taxable everywhere within your state.
I think Representative Storr has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just curious whether there are other kinds of programs that could accomplish the same thing that wouldn't be a sales tax holiday, that would make sense for helping students and their families.
Thoughts on that, Mr. Fanning?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr. Yes, there are other programs I've seen in other states. Again, it does vary, and you've really got to consider if the state is part of the streamlined sales tax agreement or not. Last I checked, I'm not sure if Texas was. And so there are programs where I've seen sales tax holidays. I've also seen reimbursement programs where you pay the sales tax up front to the retailer, and then you submit tax back, you submit your receipts actually to the taxing jurisdiction and then get a credit back on your taxes. You'll get a check from that department. Now, if that were the case, if this was the will of the legislative body, the fiscal impact as far as administratively for the Department of Revenue would be significantly different.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Man, you got a rapid fire today on the committee. Okay, appreciate you being here, and you'll be here throughout the meeting then.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr.
Okay,
Chairman.
thank you very much. Nice. Okay, are there any other elected officials or any other agency folks here who would like to talk on this? Seeing none, we're going to open this up to public comment. How about those who are, and how about we go with those opposed to the bill? We'll just do it like that. Anybody opposed to the bill? Okay, go ahead. Let's hear from anyone opposed to the bill. It's nice to see you two sitting beside each other. That's the way it works. It's all good.
Good morning, Mr.
Morning.
Chairman, members of the committee. I will leave my comments brief on what Representative Landon told me earlier this morning, but my name is Ashley Harpstreet. I'm the Executive Director for Wyoming Taxpayers Association. Wyoming Taxpayers Association is a 501c4 think tank with a 501c3 research arm. We are not pro-tax, we are not anti-tax, but our mission centers around advocating for sound tax policy for a healthy Wyoming economy. WTA believes sound tax policy is framed by a tax structure that is justified, equitable, stable, and transparent. We recognize the tool that exemptions can play in building a sound, viable economy for Wyoming, but also recognizes exemptions are a privilege to conducting commerce. We further recognize exemptions may erode the existing tax base, thereby creating pressure to seek other revenue sources. As such, existing and proposed exemptions should be scrutinized for the long-term effects on overall revenue collections. Just as new taxes or increases in existing taxes should meet a cornerstones analysis, we believe that existing and new exemptions should be analyzed on the merits to be included in Wyoming's tax structure. With that in mind, we have created an exemption justification analysis. We take the concepts of cornerstones of taxation and evaluate the merits of the exemptions. Some of the questions we ask: is this exemption justified? What measurable benefits and return on investments will citizens gain? Is the exemption equitable? Does the exemption disadvantage one taxpayer over another? Does the exemption create pressure to increase taxes on other taxpayers? Is this exemption stable? Do the benefits of the exemption outweigh or offset a sustained loss of tax revenue created by the exemption? Will the exemption provide opportunity to diversify the economy and in due time expand the tax base? And finally, is this exemption transparent, accountable, and audible? Is it efficient to administer and enforce? How will the benefits and effects of the exemption be measured? And what public reporting is required, and who is accountable? Mr. Chairman, based off of that criteria and careful consideration, we oppose House Bill 71, Sales Tax Holiday Back to School, as it fails to be sound tax policy for the following reasons. It is not justified as there is no evidence that Wyoming consumers or retailers would benefit in the long run from such a proposal. Tax holidays encourage prior markup of products, which then defeats the purpose of the exemption of the sales tax. Tax holidays are not measured and represent bad tax policy. If there's a need for the exemption, in the appropriate policy discussion should be centered around the taxation rate. Additionally, the time period is arbitrary and no clawback provisions are to be applied. It is not equitable as the relief is targeted at a specific population with specific products. There is a specific price cap for items and it is not broadly applied. This policy consideration, if applied, will disadvantage one taxpayer over another. The exemption will eventually create pressure to increase taxes on taxpayers, as the fiscal note, in my understanding, indicates a $3.3 million annual reduction in revenues that would not be repealed when revenues decline, thus applying pressure on rates on the expansion of the imposition. The exemption is not stable since the consumer behavior is unknown and could likely delay transactions until the holiday timeframe takes effects. It would influence consumer choice in which products to buy. Additionally, tax holidays erode the tax base and the lack of the ability to diversify economic activity. Finally, it is not transparent as the benefits are unknown and the effect will be a shortage in revenue. Additionally, the exemption will be tough to administer for the retailers and online vendors. Vendors would have to enter in every item into their system for a short amount of time and then revert back to the original coding. I do want to note, if you have our Wyoming tax summary on page 51, the tax rate for the average tax rate for Texas is 8.13%. I'd have to look that up, Mr. Chairman.
It's over 200, yeah. Yeah, 8.1 and 200 services. Okay. And we have 53 or something at 5.3. It's a beautiful thing. Okay. Questions, Ms. Harpster, Representative Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Harpster, thank you for being here and giving us your take on this particular bill. As you went through those things, you mentioned that we don't really know what the outcome will be. Do you see that there might be some value in doing something like this so that we can study it? It's a small scale exemption where we could kind of find out if it's helpful, if it's hurtful.
Mr. Chairman,
yeah.
Representative Bear, when you hear my next testimony on House Bill 72, I think that's a great idea to study exemptions and look at the long-term effect of them, because some of them do make sense. Thank you.
Also, it's not going to be the exact same testimony then. There's such, and I said, folks who, I mean, it's an interesting topic to have these two bills back to back. Very good. Any other questions? Okay, and we'll have Representative Brown to thank for that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other folks here who are opposed to this bill? Anybody in favor of the bill? Okay, go ahead, Mr. Winnie.
Mr. Chairman, Bill Winnie, Sublette County. The question that you just had in front of you was whether a family would benefit or not, and whether they would take advantage of it. Along the course of my Navy career, I was stationed in the island of Guam. They have a Kmart there that's probably one of the bigger ones in the system at the time. School supplies in Japan are so expensive that families from Japan would fly down to Guam and buy a year's worth of school supplies. And you would see it. They'd be moving shopping carts full of paper, pencils, etc., from the Kmart back down to some fancy hotel. Now, it may take families a year or two to figure this out, but if they can plan out a year's worth of school supplies, I think the families will benefit. Subject to your questions, thank you.
Okay, thank you for being here and your testimony. Okay, very good. Any other folks here in favor of the bill? Okay, anyone online wants to testify on this? Any hands up? Don't see any? Okay, so we're gonna close public comment. Members, what's your pleasure on the bill? Do we have a motion on the bill? Been moved by Representative Bear, seconded by Representative Oakley. Okay, members, we'll just work through this bill page by page. Page 1. And if you have any amendments, page 2. Any amendments to page 2? Okay, members, just looking at page 2, you can look those over. The big ones are lines 7 through 9. That computer caught my eye watching this bill. Okay. Not sensing any amendments yet. Page 3, page 4. Okay, page 5. Page 6. Any amendments, members? Representative Zwanitzer.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I would move an amendment. It would actually replace section 2 on page 6, line 9, that says, it basically would be a sunset clause for 4 years until July 1st, 2027. That it would be effective for 4 years, and then if this passed, we would see the effects. We could quantify if people withheld purchasing until that week and what the true effects on the economy were.
Okay, so it'd be an experiment. So the motion, is there a second for discussion? Second by Representative Oakley. Go ahead, Representative Zwanitzer. Any other discussions? Pretty self-explanatory.
I do think, Mr. Chairman, that we have, for the first time in a while, some good revenues, and that we should be benefiting the people of our state with that, with the bonus we're getting currently. And this is one way that I think gives back to the kids and people furthering their education. I just don't know if we enter another dark time. We have so many exemptions that I get worried we won't be able to take it off. So I think we should share the wealth when we can, and the next 4 years are looking fairly bright right now.
Okay. Okay, you've heard the motion. Any other discussion? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. Okay, that motion's been adopted. Any other motions? I don't like making them myself, but members on, well, I just really, it'd be in both places on 3 and 5. On, really on the computer purchases, be paragraph Roman 2 and 3 on page 3, and then same on page 5, and then other conforming language on the computers. It's a large, expensive purchase. Yeah, not generally a back-to-school type purchase. So that's my motion. Is there a second?
Is your motion to delete
Remove
it or
it,
remove it?
remove, yes, I'm sorry. No second? Okay. Thank you very much, committee. Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah, go ahead, Representative Swanson.
I'd move the price down to $800 on those two sections on computer hardware. So right now it's $1,500, but I think for the foreseeable future, a computer for school, without all those cool gaming capacities, if it's for educational purposes, you can get one for about $800.
Okay, so that motion is, same motion, but to reduce it, not to eliminate it. Any second on that?
Second.
Okay, it's been seconded by Representative Northrup. Okay, I'm writing that $800. So any discussion? All those discussion, Representative Bear?
I'm going to be opposed to this amendment just because of the complexity I think it's going to add for retailers, just having to divide out which computers will be exempt and which ones will not.
Okay, so it's the $800. So if you, as I understand this, you buy a $1,000 computer, 800 of it's exempt. Is that how you're?
No, I think my reading, Mr. Chairman, it would have to be under 800.
Under
Anything
800.
over that price, you're still
Okay.
paying full tax on
Full.
$7.99 computers all day long.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Okay, members, any further discussion? All those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Oppose?
No.
That motion has failed. Okay, any other motions on this little bill? Question being called on the bill.
Discussion.
Any further discussion? Representative Oakley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I would just like to say, I'm interested in an opt-out. I admittedly understand enough about the streamlined sales tax agreement that evidently we're a part of. I find it ironic to say it's streamlining but not being able to opt out, because it seems to me that it would be easier for compliance if some people can just choose not to do it, then we don't have that compliance issue. So that's not for now, but I'll work with the department, and I would maybe bring an amendment on the floor, but that, just for discussion, I am interested in the opt-out option.
I would just reiterate what Representative Oakley just said. The complexity is an issue for me, but I think it's worth giving it a try and see how it turns out.
This is House Bill 71. Turn on my mic. House Bill 71 as amended.
All right, ready for the vote. Representative Bear,
Aye.
Representative Byron,
No.
Representative Locke. Representative Northrup,
No.
Representative Oakley,
Aye.
Representative Storer,
No.
Representative Strock,
No.
Representative Zwanitzer,
Aye.
I wasn't even keeping count, but I think I kind of know what the count is. And,
Chairman Harshman.
and I'll vote to move this to the floor. That's an aye.
Let's have some fun.
Yes. Are you ready for the count? There were 5 ayes and 4 noes.
Me. Okay, Representative Brown, we are on House Bill 72. Walk us through your bill.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. If you like that bill, you're going to love this one. Mr. Chairman, I'd also point out the great crowd that I have amassed today. This is the most important group of people I've ever amassed in one location for a single bill. So I just want to say I appreciate them coming out to have this discussion.
Think of the economic development. They traveling.
A lot of good minds here, a lot of good minds. Mr.
good.
Chairman, seeing the opportunity here of how many people are here to speak and frankly in opposition of this bill, and I recognize that, I will keep my comments very brief and open again for discussion. This is a very simple bill. What I did is a kind of a utopian discussion with the attorneys at LSO, and I said, I want a level playing field. What I would like is I'd like to remove all exemptions, and I'd like to lower our sales tax, and then I would also like to add services. So this is a combination of basically three pieces of our tax code wrapped into one bill. And what you see here is we remove all the exemptions. If you go to the bill, that's where you see most of the repealers. There is also one repealer in there that you see that removes the 0.5% sales tax. That's just kind of a goofy portion of our tax code. We have a 3.5% in one location and then 0.5% in another, which takes us to 4%. That is one of the repealers, and I can go through that if you would like me to. But ultimately what my thought was is about 4 years ago, I started having this discussion across the state with how much our tax base is focused on coal, oil, natural gas, the extractive industries. And when we were facing economic downturns of $600+ million, and we were looking at raising sales tax by 1% to try to help with the revenue increase, what I heard from all the extractive industries is when you tax that 1%, yes, you're looking at the majority of the families across the state, but really you're disproportionately hitting those extractive industries because they're going to end up paying more for that dump truck, or they're going to end up paying more for that long wall excavation equipment, or whatever the case may be. That 1% disproportionately affects our extractive industries over the general public. And so it got me thinking, well, why is that? And so I started looking at this bill, and what I noticed is that we have more exemptions on our tax code than we do actual taxes. So I said, let's remove all the exemptions and let's have a discussion, Mr. Chairman. And I said, I really don't mind this committee amending the living daylights out of this bill, and I hope you do. But what I hope you guys recognize is this is a bill to start a discussion on having an equitable tax base. And this is only for sales and use tax. This isn't property taxes. This isn't going to be everything. This is the first step in a very long marathon to actually start looking at our tax structure. And I do recognize that this bill as written, it takes us down to a 2.5% sales tax across the state. Well, that's an economic hit, in my opinion, for the families across Wyoming to see a reduction. But we're broadening that tax base to services. Why do we bring services into it? Well, we bring services into it because we're a service-based economy now. We're no longer a sales-based economy. We don't just purchase things at the store at retail and call it good. We're also a services-based economy. And what really struck a chord is I have friends that have businesses where they perform services, and they don't have to collect and remit sales tax back to the state. But I also have friends that run businesses here that are retail, and they're required to. That doesn't seem very equitable to me. What I see is a disproportionate effect on those that have a small business that have to remit sales tax back. But for whatever reason, we've decided that services, easiest one to think of is getting your hair cut. How about getting your carpets cleaned? Whatever the case may be, we see those things that they don't collect sales tax. They charge you $100, you pay $100. There's nothing on top of that. So my goal with this bill was to bring an equitable discussion to the table. Frankly, I see that I have, I might have ruffled a few feathers, and I'm okay with that. What I would like to have is a frank discussion about our tax structure. Now, what I will do is run through a quick list of some notes that I have here on the bill, and then if you guys have questions, I'll stand for those. The bill is fairly simple. I've explained the general concept of the bill in nature, and I'll go from there. So what does it do? It removes all exemptions on the books, including ag and groceries. I'm not against changing these, but I think we have to have the discussion whether the exemptions are truly worth their value to us as a state. It reduces the tax rate from 4 to 2.5%, charges for services at the same rate as our sales industries. Our tax structure is outdated, and this is the first step. Our mineral industries already pay their share. This bill attempts to level that playing field across the board. This is my utopian bill, but maybe even just a little less than that, because I also kept in, as you look, I believe it's on page 3, I'm working off memory here, that I keep legal and banking services. I have my reasons for those. I'll reserve if you guys want to ask about those, I'll be more than happy to do those. I'm okay with amending those out as well to really level the playing field if you so choose. But again, back to the fact that we're a service-based economy and we're no longer sales-based. My bill tried unsuccessfully to bring everybody together to say that a reduction in the rate, but broadening the scope would be beneficial for Wyoming as a whole. I recognize that each industry has their reasoning for their exemptions, but my reasoning is equity for Wyoming. Please have this discussion. Members of this committee, I am urging a very serious discussion I planned on bringing this 4 years ago, but with a fiscal note of nearly $200 million, it's a pill to swallow. And you certainly can't have that discussion when you're already $600 million in the hole. So this bill sat in my drawer and waited patiently to be brought at a time where we have $1 billion surplus. Where are we going to be able to find this? Well, we actually have the capability of doing this, and I think this would actually have an economic impact that we're assuming a lot of things in this in this fiscal note that we don't know for sure are actually going to be the case. At the end of the day, I ask that you bring this bill out of the committee, amend it as you see fit as a committee, but let's have 62 minds look at this bill and have the discussion on the open floor of the House of Representatives. If the bill dies out there on the House of Representatives, I'm okay with that. But what I would like us to have is have 62 minds try to mesh together and see what 62 people can come up with for a fair and equitable tax structure. Let the lobbyists and let the people who have the industries that they represent work their magic, if they see fit, to apply their exemptions and work their tails off to show that their exemptions mean more economic diversification than if we were to include them in our sales tax basis. This is a discussion point, ladies and gentlemen. This is not what I'm asking for you to pass this bill out of here with no amendments. I am simply bringing this bill together to have a discussion on how our tax structure is based for sales tax right now. I hope that you will look at this with the complete opportunity after all the negative comments that you will hear behind me, and I am completely aware that they are, I can feel the eyes staring me down, but I'm okay with that. I think it's a very important discussion for us as elected representatives to recognize that our state has an outdated tax policy, and it's time for us to work on that tax policy. Mr. Chairman, I stand for any questions.
Thank you, Representative Brown. Any questions for the good representative? Okay, my first question is just on the fiscal note. You know, the 157 growing to $170 million hit to the general fund. It's not as much to local government, obviously, because you don't affect their tax rate of 1% to 2%, whatever they have. But why didn't you go like 3.3 or whatever that break-even number is? That's my first question.
Mr. Chairman, it's a great question. Why didn't I go revenue neutral? My discussion on this topic, in all honesty, was to have a fair discussion to attempt to level the playing field, that the people that are out here behind me right now that are exempt, one of the biggest things that I've heard in my 7 years in the legislature now is that people want a stable tax structure. People who are looking at moving to this state are interested in having something stable, not a knee-jerk reaction when we have a hit to our budget of $600 million to immediately raise by 1% sales tax. So my goal was to say, hey, look, I understand that you're exempt right now, but you're going to come into the mix and we're going to have a discussion on this. I'm not asking you to come to the table with the full 4% that we're doing. What I'd like you to do is recognize that I'm coming in both ways. I'm bringing you in, but I'm also removing the sales tax from everybody else down to that 2.5%. I value the understanding that we could go revenue neutral, and I welcome that amendment. My discussion was more to just say, let's have a stable tax and let's work on it with that at a 2.5% rate.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Representative Bear?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Brown, when you were drafting this bill, was there any concern as you remove the exemption for food of the regressive nature of that move?
Go ahead, Representative Brown.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Bear, absolutely. And so as you see the bill actually provides for a kind of a unique factor that I would personally, I would ask the committee to consider either removing completely or amending as you see fit. But it provides the opportunity for each county to put this before their electors and decide whether or not they choose to have the sales tax on groceries. The reason being is we lifted the sales tax on groceries and exempted that. I'm trying to draw a blank there. 2004. Okay. And that was a major hit to our cities, towns, and counties. And what we saw with that, Representative Bear, is now that those cities, towns, and counties comes back every year, they're begging us, right, for their $60 million to make sure that they stay afloat. Well, the discussion has come back and forth in my 7 years again on the regressive nature of adding a sales tax to groceries. And my point on that is the majority of the people that would be hit by the sales tax on groceries also have a qualifying governmental assistance program that would be beneficial to them in this case. So think SNAP 10, if those types of things. There's already government programs that would exempt them back from the sales tax and or pay the sales tax for them as this applies to them. So my thought on this, and I sponsored an amendment to remove sales tax exemption on groceries with Representative Zwanitzer last year. I believe it's the right thing to do. I think that there are government programs out there that support this already. And I think it's a fair and equitable way for our municipalities and our counties to receive the revenue without having to come back to us every single year.
Any other questions? Representative Locke, and then Representative Storr.
So, so as going through this process, what feedback or what, in terms of adding this tax to some of these services, what feedback, what input have you gotten in terms of additional complexity with that? Some of these services are, like it's mentioned in here, even lawn services, the small guy who's now all of a sudden he's completely changing the way he's doing business. Thoughts on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Locke, that's a good point. And I think that comes back to one of my earlier statements that it shouldn't matter which industry you choose to go into business for yourself. If we are going to ask a business to collect a tax, I think it should be an equitable tax base and everybody should be collecting and remitting back to the state. Yes, there will be an impact to some of these smaller businesses. My friends who own lawn care businesses, my friends who own the carpet cleaning businesses or anything along those lines are going to be forced to collect and remit sales tax back to the state. I view that as an equitable share, and yes, there will be some complexity to this, but it's not something, again, very similar to the last bill, that can't be overcome. I do recognize the plight of a small business in having that, but bringing in some of the other discussions, to be completely honest with you, the amount of people that we have back behind me is not unrecognizable to me. I knew that I was going to have quite a few people here, but I did not hear from many people after I put this bill out. I put this bill out, it's numbered 72 for a reason, it was out early. I've only received calls from probably 2 or 3 lobbyists to have a discussion on this particular bill. I would like to have had more, and I would like to have had the discussion of why that is, but I think we're going to hear that today from them. And I think it's up to this committee's infinite wisdom and the 62 of us, if you choose to move it forward, as to whether or not we want to continue down the road that we're doing right now, which is exempting as much as we are, or if we want to level that playing field.
Storr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Brown, I appreciate you bringing this bill. I agree with the idea that we need to broaden our sales tax base and align it with our economy and have a stable tax policy. I believe that we also need to look at who pays for these different services, what income levels they're at, with the idea of trying to create a more equitable tax policy overall for the state. So with that goal in mind, I would like to understand the reasoning behind the exemptions for legal and banking services. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr, thank you for the question. My original intent behind legal is in similar in nature to what the feeling is for groceries, is the regressive nature. The people who tend to need legal services in our state that are the mom and pops find themselves in a small lawsuit with a bigger company. They need to file for divorce, whatever the case may be. I see it as a regressive nature, and legal services are already expensive. And so tacking on here in Laramie County 6% on top of that, the government trying to make their money off of me filing for divorce or me getting filed for divorce against, I don't view that as an equitable way. But I have also had subsequent discussions after filing this bill with other members of this body that we also have a lot of corporate law. And a lot of corporate law could absolutely be benefited by the state for collecting some of that. When it comes to the banking services, very similar in nature. When we actually have and utilize any amount of banking just to keep our money safe, the idea that we want to tax and have government make money off of somebody keeping my money because that's a safe place to keep it, probably not the best recommendation. And so those are the reasons why I chose to keep those in there. Again, though, I am absolutely not opposed to having those stricken and having the discussion. I believe you're going to hear from plenty of people that would say that we need to keep those and they like those exemptions, but those were my reasons for keeping those 2 exempt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Just the nature of sales tax, is you know, it's a flat tax, so it's regressive, right? And, but ours is low, but I think this point of broadening though, I think is an interesting, I remember Chairman Madden used to always talk about, you know, 50 years ago, it was 60-70% goods sold in Wyoming, only 30% services, and how that's shifted now. We really are a service base. You mentioned that in your opening comments, 60-70%. I guess your thoughts, you know, this idea of broadening and lowering the tax rate, it's not a new idea. I mean, I appreciate you bringing it for a learning experience, if anything, to us, but we have a low tax rate, but we have a very narrow tax. And in this service piece, I think Representative Storr brings that point up. Who's purchasing these 70% services now? It's generally not the folks that you're targeting in your last bill. And these are really, but I think as we look at other states too and see what other states are doing, it gives good examples and information as well. But so the legal part you talked about, you have every other, that's the only one you've left out then, our legal services.
Mr. Chairman, the only other one that we don't
Healthcare.
have a discussion is healthcare. Yes, and you and I have actually had this discussion since the implementation of this bill being online and available, that there is the opportunity for healthcare. Again, I look at healthcare as already expensive in Wyoming. That's kind of the first and foremost. But secondly, there is an opportunity for us to have some of that paid back by the federal government through Medicare, Medicaid. I don't know the complexities of that, and frankly, to get into that discussion would be a deeper dive, but I would certainly welcome that discussion as well.
How about the mortuary embalming? Is that in here?
Mr. Chairman, it is. I have removed all those exemptions. I have already had those discussions this morning. You know, one would argue that you don't want to be paying tax at the hardest time of somebody's life and dealing with the death of a loved one. I certainly have a heartfelt understanding of that, but I also recognize it as a service. And again, we have a very narrow service amount. And I do believe that if we start exempting one, you see what we have right now is we exempt more than we actually tax.
Right.
And so I would just, you know, I would urge the committee to look at these exemptions with a fine tooth comb and determine whether or not these exemptions actually provide the economy with a set influence more than what their tax base would be.
Sure. Okay, any other questions? Okay,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
thank you for your presentation today. Any folks, any elected officials or Department of Revenue, any electeds would like to visit on this? Department of Revenue, nobody's coming up on this one? Okay, I guess so. Welcome back, Mr. Fanning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Brett Fanning, Excise Tax Administrator, Wyoming Department of Revenue. And so as Representative Brown did a great job of explaining kind of what is happening with this bill. And my phone has actually been ringing off the hook with this bill. And so, Mr. Chairman, if I could, there's really two questions that I've been really getting. If I could run through those briefly, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The first one is, does this diversify Wyoming's economy? And so this is a big talking point. It has been for years and years. And the answer to that is no. And the reason I say that is because in all my research with this bill, I've learned that there is a very big difference between diversifying your economy and diversifying your tax base. And that's the difference with this bill. And so I've heard that from a lot of folks around the state saying, does this diversify the economy? The answer is no, but it does make a fundamental change to the tax structure. That was the question number one. Question number two is, okay, so I'm a normal person here in the state of Wyoming. I have a couple kids, I work a normal job, I live in the city. Is this good for me or not? Because there's a lot of things going on with this bill, right? You've got a decrease in the tax rate, you're getting rid of exemptions, but then you're going to be taxing more. The overall effect, is that good or bad for me? And so I have danced around that answer. And the reason I do that is because if you make more taxable purchases, yeah, this bill would be good for you. But if you don't make taxable purchases, say your only budget expense is food, then maybe that's a different answer for you. If you do buy a car or have any large purchases, this bill as written is something that this legislative body should maybe have a discussion about. So those are the two questions I received from your constituents is diversifying economy and does this help me? Now, as far as the tax administration piece, the first one is, as written, this bill puts us out of compliance with the streamlined sales tax agreement. And it is that county option on the food. And so again, you don't want to be out of compliance with the streamlined sales tax agreement. Wyoming was really, Director Noble, former director of the Department of Revenue, was actually per se one of the founding members of that agreement. And what it does is it makes retailers, if they register in a streamlined state, they know there's going to be similarities in definitions and tax administration policies. And so allowing the county option to vote on if food is taxable or not would put this out of compliance, put Wyoming out of compliance. What does that mean? It means we could potentially lose our voting rights and then potentially be removed from that agreement. And so it is something to consider from the tax administration piece of it. So as you've read the fiscal note, there is a lot of references here to the state of South Dakota. And the reason we do that is for a couple different reasons. They're a regional partner, regional neighbor, plus they tax a lot of these things that Wyoming currently doesn't. So when I was asked to prepare this fiscal note, I had nowhere to go because right now our statutes don't require a lot of these folks to license with us, but they do. And so that's where there's a lot of reference here to the state of South Dakota. And that brings us to the Wyoming Department of Revenue Excise Tax Division, my administration, our fiscal impact here. And so with this dramatic change in Wyoming's tax structure, if this were to become legislation, we would need more people. And there's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. When I looked at the state of South Dakota's personnel for sales tax administration, they have double the folks we do. And then if you do a population adjustment, which again, this fiscal note is full of population adjustments, and sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad, but then you're still talking about additional people to help me administer this. Remember, we're going to be licensing a lot of folks, and I don't want to put a number on that, but a lot of folks that are currently not licensed with us as current. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I will stand for any questions.
Committee. Representative Northrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you tell us how many more additional staff you'll have to be able to maintain this program?
Mr. Fanning.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, yes. In my fiscal note, I have budgeted or requested for 15 additional folks. Now that's important because right now I have 33 total staff. So it is an additional growth to government. But again, it goes off of reviewing the state of South Dakota and what they do for tax administration. Again, it's important to note that in the state of South Dakota, their audit division is in the same department. Here in Wyoming, it's different. So if there were to be, or if the legislative body wanted to maintain any sort of audit coverage, the Department of Audit, who we are the administrative agency for, would need to be reviewed as well.
Representative Oakley has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Fanning. So you said it was repealing the sales tax exemption on food would be what put us out of compliance with the streamline agreement. Is that correct?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Oakley, yes, ma'am, that is correct.
Okay, Representative Locke, do you have a question?
Thank you,
Go
Mr.
ahead.
Chairman. Do you have a good feel on how this would impact manufacturing in terms of the impact on our manufacturing industry? Do you have any thoughts? Have you looked into that? Is that an area where we've looked at how these taxes might affect them?
Go ahead, Mr. Fanning.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Locke, yes, absolutely. So it is important to note that there are 8 exemptions that are going to be repealed here. The state of Wyoming has more exemptions. That's just what was in this bill. And one of those is the manufacturing exemption. And so if I had previously testified during the summer related to exemptions. And so, yes, there would be a repeal in that exemption, so it would no longer be afforded to manufacturers. And so that is important to note. What we've also seen based on other discussions is that, yes, manufacturing has become an important industry in the state of Wyoming. And so the intent of an exemption, of any exemption, is that, and Director Henson says this very, very well, is that an exemption is something that's so important to the state of Wyoming that everyone else is willing to share that burden. And so with the manufacturing exemption that we have in place right now, the legislature has said this is a very important exemption because it brings businesses to the state of Wyoming. Now, in the past, I know a lot of manufacturers, very good for Wyoming, but then a lot of that product is sent outside of the state of Wyoming. Not all of it, not all of it. And I know I'll have phone calls on my voicemail when I get back up to the office, but there is a lot of it that is sent outside of Wyoming. And the intent of a lot of exemptions is that, hey, we're going to exempt the purchase of that machinery so that you can collect tax on the sales side. And if you ship it outside Wyoming, the state of Wyoming does not see that tax.
What states where it's purchased in would tax it?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. And Wyoming would as well,
Yeah,
if it was shipped into Wyoming.
right.
Mr.
Okay,
Chairman.
Representative Storr has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Fanning. Did you happen to run any scenarios running this, the exemptions that are in this bill currently for a revenue neutral outcome?
Mr. Fanning?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr, yes, I have started on that. I was actually working on it this morning because I'd received feedback saying, hey, if this were revenue neutral, this is something I could really get behind. And so I was not done with that analysis, but it does look to be, it's somewhere in that 3+%. And again, if you go back to some of the questions I was receiving, if you start to tip that rate up, then that average family of 4, that the person, the average family in Wyoming, then maybe this doesn't make sense for them.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Follow up. It might be helpful also to look at that scenario without taking out the grocery exemption. That would also be helpful.
Right, and I think we've got most of these LSO staff. Mr. Tempty has most of these worked up for us already, so we can access that. But, okay, very good. Okay, thank you for your testimony. Appreciate you being here. Okay, I'm sorry. Representative Swanser had a question.
I don't have a question, Mr. Chairman, but when
Okay.
the witness is done, I do have a question for you.
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Fanning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Swanser.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I was just hoping if we could hear for anyone who supports the bill
Right.
first. and-
Absolutely. So, but I want to ask, are there any elected officials? See none online. Okay, no other departments. Okay, gonna move to those folks. Members, okay. Anyone in favor of the bill? Anybody here? Anybody online in favor of the bill?
Anyone?
Representative Brown, any closing comments for us?
Mr. Chairman, just very briefly, I would like to say, I think Mr. Fanning did an excellent job. First of all, my apologies to him for having to field all these phone calls. I would say that the people who most likely would benefit from this are working right now, right? They're working just a couple hundred feet to our west here. They're working downtown. They're the ones that are going to see mostly a reduction in their tax base. The people that you see behind me are certainly going to see an increase in what they do because they have the exemptions. And I am fully recognizing that we are going to have a discussion that we are going to increase taxes on some people in Wyoming. The general public is going to see a decrease with the way the bill is written right now. And I just would like to make mention that the people who would be here to speak on behalf of this, the families, they are working. and they're not able to be here. They're not even able to Zoom in right now because they're working at Target. They're working at the state. They're doing the things that they have to be doing. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I will open it up to the floor and to your prerogative of everybody else who may be against this bill.
Here's what I think I'm not sure how this bill's gonna go, but I kind of have an idea. I think anybody have any motions on this bill? Representative Zwanitzer?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had moved to table the bill at this point.
Okay, so a motion to table. And that is that debatable? It's not debatable.
I would just table it indefinitely for this session. But possible interim topic.
So there is no debate on that motion to table, and it's just an immediate vote. All those members in favor to table the bill, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no.
No.
Okay, the bill has been tabled. I think this will be an excellent interim topic, and it's such a learning curve to all this. And then we can learn what Texas and South Dakota do and what we do. And be very interesting. So thank you all for being here today. That bill is tabled. Okay, the next bill and thank you, Representative Brown. The next bill we have is Bill number 7.
I'm gonna go down there.
Sure. And we'll let the room clear out a little bit.
Mr. Chairman, there's one person online. If they'd like to testify, if they'd raise their hand, I will know.
Okay, committee, we're back at it now. Before us is House Bill 7, Underage Marriage Amendments. Representative Zwanitzer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee. Pleased to bring you House Bill 7 this morning. an underage marriage amendment. And so just very high level, so we're on the same page, marriage is a right reserved to the states under our Constitution. So each state individually sets their parameters around marriage, including the minimum age of marriage. Right now, 8 states in the country do not have any minimum age, including Wyoming. So we're one of 8 states. I did email you all a map this morning with the minimum marriage age in each state, if you have that in your email. Our statute in Wyoming is 21-102, and that statute does have what I would call a suggested age at age 16, but there's provisions that as long as you have a judge who decides to marry someone younger than 16, they just tell the county clerk to issue that license. And so in Wyoming, when it says judge, we look to 21-106, and that means every district or circuit court judge, district court commissioner, Supreme Court justice, or magistrate. And so those are the people who would be considered judges allowing someone to get married. Currently, they could do it at really any age under Wyoming law. I did something really cool on a personal note where I actually had one of our Supreme Court justices marry me, which not marry me personally, but perform my marriage. So that is something available to the Wyoming public if you can find a justice who would like to do that. I did also, so on this bill, it has, I guess I'd call it an old friend. We have seen it before on attempts to amend that marriage age in Wyoming 3 years ago. And it did get caught up in a little bit of controversy when it comes to religious freedom, quite honestly, right? There are, as I think we all know, some religious sects who don't believe the government should be involved in marriage and setting that marriage age. And so what I did in this bill, the previous bill several years ago just did a floor of 18. No one under 18 in Wyoming can get married. We went through our existing statutes. I had LSO and went through them because we do have some statutes on emancipation, on homeless minors, homeless youth. So there are provisions at 16 and 17 where you can basically be emancipated or the legal equivalent and have availability to enter into other contracts. Where this would get, I guess, most maybe prevalent or appropriate to this discussion is pregnancy, right? 16 or 17-year-olds can and do get pregnant, and then we discuss marriage in those circumstances depending. There are national groups out there who are certainly pushing the issue of marriage at 18, no exceptions. And so I did also email the committee the bill from 3 years ago that has that specific language. And so what I've tried to do in this bill before you in House Bill 7 is to meet those already existing carve-outs in Wyoming law that do allow 16 or 17-year-olds the possibility to get married with an actual district court or circuit court judge to allow that. But if it was the committee's pleasure, as I know it is, some of the testimony you'll hear, maybe it should just be 18. I have no concerns with that. So that's basically the bill, Mr. Chairman. Just setting an age in our statute, I think, is extremely important to stop child marriage. Be happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Any questions of Representative Swanser? Very good. No questions of the committee? Representative Locke?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Swanser, question for you. What are there groups, these religious groups you talk about? I know we have a range of different groups. Which of those do you think are impacted by this? I mean, I'm sure we have Amish, other people. I don't mean to call any out, but just thoughts on that.
Representative?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Locke, in trying to be delicate, there have been testimony from people throughout Wyoming and certain parts of the state who have shared that they have religious groups in their areas who may have some of these practices, and without specifying some of those groups in some of our constituencies, there has been a concern previously with this bill in parts of Wyoming that we may have some of these religious groups who do have child marriage, and that it is, the right of that religion, not the state, to set that marriage age.
Any other questions? You got a follow-up, Representative Locke?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just real quick, do you have a feel, sorry if I wasn't sensitive, I apologize for that. Do you have a good feel for how many of those are what's the population of folks with those practices? I do not. I'm just curious if we do.
You know, and Mr. Chairman, Representative Locke, I believe you'll hear testimony. There are 4 or 5 states where this is, I would say, a significant issue, who have certain religious denominations in those areas that have a higher proportion of child marriage than we do in Wyoming. I mean, it certainly is not, I think, what we'd call a problem here in our state. So I'm really just trying to, go where 42 other states have and set a floor in our statutes. But I'm not aware of any active religious group that's going to be testifying today saying, please don't pass this. I did hear from 2 parties in the state. One was a homeschooling group, and another is a kind of religious sect that said, stay out of marriage. It's not a government thing, it's a religious thing.
Hey, Representative Oakley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Swanitzer, are you aware of any legal challenges that have been made, or if it's been upheld as far as First Amendment, anything like that in relation to this?
Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chairman, I don't believe I am aware of any legal challenges. They would probably come from within that state. As I said, marriages or states regulate the age of marriage. So they would be state level challenges. I haven't heard of any federal level challenges on, an equal protection or due process type endeavor that would set some type of floor for each state to have a marriage age.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman, for being here for this bill. I apologize, I was gone for the first moments of your presentation, so forgive me if you already covered this, but what was the impetus of you bringing this bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Bear. The impetus, quite honestly, was it had come before the body 4 years ago and 5 years ago by another member. I had co-sponsored at that time, and it was just kind of shocking to me that it didn't make it all the way through the process. I think 5 years ago there was the Me Too movement, was certainly very vocal in the country, and that's, I believe, when various national groups really started pushing, the campaign to set that minimum marriage age in every state. So this was an old friend of the body, but it really was one of those things in my tenure that I thought was kind of an easy thing to do that hadn't been done, and so I brought it back this year.
Try to move to, we got folks here who want to testify, and our time is limited, so we want to, and I'll just open this up for or against the bill. Nobody here from state government, no elected, so I think if you want to speak, just fill these 3 seats, and then you can, as soon as one opens, you can fill that seat. So it looks like we only have 2 people want to speak on this bill.
These 2 do.
Yeah, come on up, boy, just fill them up, and we're just going to start with you. Thanks for being here, and introduce yourself and who you represent.
My name is Denise. I'm not sure if my mic, thank you. My name is Denise Parrish, and I'm with the Zonta Club of Cheyenne. Zonta, and I emailed each of the committee members a handout last night. I've given physical copies as well to your staff. Zonta of Cheyenne is part of Zonta International, which has a signature project globally to end all child marriage below the age of 18. We support that goal. However, given the lack of minimum age limits in Wyoming, we believe this is a good start. I mean, we'd prefer to see the limit be 18 rather than 16, but we do support this bill as a starting point. Just a couple of things that we wanted to point out is that the handout has several sections on it. One is there are only a handful of states that still have no minimum age to marry. And that's on the back of the back of the handout, and that lists those states. And as you look at that, you'll find that a number of those states do involve family court or family services looking before the judge has to sign off. There has to be some sort of discussion about making sure there's no coercion, making sure that this marriage is entered into by the minors willingly and so forth. So that's something, if the committee chose to think about that might be something of interest to you. We would also note that there are now 7 states just in the last few years that have gone with 18 no exceptions. And this is a movement that we are seeing more and more of. Just 2 more points. I appreciate your time, but 2 more points of things that really can go wrong. There's a number of statistics that point out that minors that marry early have, and the marriage doesn't work out, really have some terrible circumstances in their life. But 2 things that are really troubling, and we've discussed when the bill came before the legislature before, is that most shelters or safe houses will not accept minors, so that if there is abuse in the marriage and there is a minor involved, then they often do not have the same resources that adults would have for that abuse. And the second thing goes to contracting. If the marriage goes wrong and the minor wants to get out of the marriage, it is difficult for minors to contract with a divorce lawyer or any kind of legal service. I did look at the unemancipated minor statute in Wyoming, and there is a list of things that they are allowed to contract for, but that does not seem to be one of them on that list. So we sort of support the bill with a little bit of reluctance because we'd like to see it a little stronger, a little better, but we do think it's a wonderful start for Wyoming.
Representative Oakley has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here. Quick question. Do you have any idea in Wyoming, the numbers of people who are availing themselves of this, meaning people getting married at 15 or younger? Do you have any numbers?
Yes, I saw some statistics and they're not current, but over about a 10-year period, I believe it was like 2000 to 2010 or so, there were about 1,500 minors who married in Wyoming. I did not have Wyoming-specific numbers of age categories. Nationwide, the majority of those minors are in the 16 and 17-year-old age group. However, the statistics do show that there have been 14-year-olds who have married in Wyoming, and we have had marriages of minors as young as 14.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you for being here with us. And
Thank you.
And we'll just keep moving. Go ahead, next, go ahead. And our time is it's 9:37 and we're gonna work this bill, so members, okay, thank you.
Good morning, Chairman, committee members. My name's Tara Muir. I'm the Public Policy Director with the Wyoming Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. I work for our coalition of crisis and shelter programs across the state. There's one in every county, and I hope you've already met yours. On a typical day in Wyoming, our programs do shelter 145 adult and child victims. We don't turn away based on age, especially with the circumstances surrounding someone needing a safe place. Another 120 are for counseling, legal advocacy, support groups. We also do 120 crisis calls. We rise to support this particular bill, and we support the exceptions to it with the 16 and 17-year-olds. Our work is all based on empowerment of victims. And when you're 16 or 17-year-old, particularly with other young people, we don't feel it's appropriate for the state to restrict who can and can't get married. As we heard from wonderful Zonta organization, too often it's very young girls and much older men. But we do support that 16 and 17-year-old exception. I had lots to say, but I'm gonna cut through it. One of the things that happened 5 or 6 years ago when this was originally brought, there were headlines that said things such as grown men are exploiting loopholes in state laws to marry children, child brides, call on US states to end legal rape. We haven't done the in-depth analysis ourselves. There's one national organization, Tariri. I'm happy to send you those resources that really looks at our child sexual assault statutes. What is a crime may, with our current law, be legal to marry them. And that is why some of these headlines were hitting then. The only thing I'll add to be speedy, there is an amendment that Colorado, who recently passed this, and most states are passing these kinds of laws, but there are a lot with the 16 or 17-year-old exceptions, that the underage person who's under 18 be established in statute, and I'm happy to send this in writing, the right to establish a domicile separate from the married person's parents. B, the rights to file motions and petitions with a court in the married person's name and on the married person's own behalf. This is most important to us, protection orders, getting out of that marriage. And C, the right to enter into enforceable contracts, the lawyer thing, but also including leases for housing, and the right to consent and make decisions concerning the married person's own medical care. With that, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Bill Winnie, Sublette County. Along the way of my Navy career, I commanded a ship with a crew of 13 to 1,400, about 250 or so women, many of them 18, 19 years old, some probably a few 17. You do see 17-year-old enlistments in the military. And my observation, and based in part on conversations with chaplains and other social services, that ship had 2 chaplains on board and of course a medical department. Age 18 is probably a minimum age for people being mature enough to take on the responsibilities that go with it. And I understand there's reasons for the exceptions here. That's a choice to be made. But my observation would be age 18, that might still be too young. On the other hand, our society is so structured that 18 is probably where they're given that choices. Along the way, I'd note my grandmother on my mother's side married at age 14. That was 1898. That was a different time, a different place. It was not uncommon then. I have a son married at age 18. Sadly, the marriage didn't last. Those things happen. And one of the things to keep in mind as you talk about the maturity is if children are a fruit of the marriage, the stable marriage in the long term is important to the child. And so the maturity of the parent makes a difference. And so I think that's part of the rationale and the reason the state has the authority. Subject to your questions, thank you.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman, Guy Bedoin. I actually am with the Wyoming Department of Health Vital Records. So marriages fall under our purview, marriage, death, birth, divorce, and stillbirths are all part of the makeup of vital records. In the last 11 years, an average of 4,200 marriages were licensed in the state of Wyoming. And with that, about 20, an 11-year average is 20 marriages per year are 18 and younger. So to ensure that we don't identify those 15 and 16-year-olds that are married, we publish in an annual report just those that are of legal age and below, so it's 18 and below. This bill is something that we would be able to provide guidance to the county clerks who issue the licenses in the instances where a party of age would go in and obtain the license, and then anything else, of course, as noted, would go to a judge. But then those documents are kept in our repository of vital records. And again, I think that this bill is one that with minimal effort, we could get rules changed and support any of those guidelines the clerks would need in an effort to issue a license. I'll stand for any questions.
Great, appreciate your clearing that up for us. Thank you for being here. Okay, go ahead, introduce yourself and where you're from.
Hi, I'm Kinsley Merritt. I'm a junior at Cody High School. I am 16 years old, and what my peers and I were discussing is that how most of us teenagers were not mature enough. We don't know how to do our taxes. We're not able to like buy property ourselves. We're not able to get tattoos or piercings. And I know that tattoos and piercings have nothing to do with it, but what I'm trying to get to my point is I think it's kind of absurd that we can get married, but all those other things, we have to have parental consent. And it's not like, sometimes I feel like maybe they don't want to get married, but they're like being pressured or like forced into it. And I just feel it's kind of weird. And when I was talking about it with my US History 2 class last Thursday and Friday, because I was informing my teachers I was going to be missing Monday and Tuesday of school this week. And when I brought up that this bill was going to be discussed during the legislature and while I was here, like a majority of the class and a majority of my peers thought it was totally crazy. They're like, what? And I was like, yes, they're discussing this and I'm hoping they'll change it because I don't feel it's quite appropriate for our age. We're not mentally stable or mature enough, I feel, to handle it. And I feel like most marriages, when they are married young, will fail.
Any questions for Ms. Merritt? Okay, Representative Oakley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Merritt, for being here. So I'm hearing you, I guess I'm clarifying. So you would like to see not the exception, because right now we don't have a minimum. So you would not want the exception for 16 and 17 and just that the minimum be 18. Am I hearing your opinion correctly?
Yes, you are hearing my opinion correctly.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Appreciate all the work you guys do. The old Cody Youth for Justice, they've been at it for many, many years. Done a lot of good. So appreciate you. Okay, anyone else would like to testify? Anybody online? Nobody online. Okay, we're gonna close public comment. Members, what's your pleasure?
I move the bill.
Okay, it's been moved by Representative Storr, seconded by Representative Oakley. Members, let's work the bill. Any amendments on page 1? Okay, page 2 and 3 are in front of us now as you flip over. Any amendments on 2 or 3? Okay, members, gonna flip over to page 4 and 5 now are up. Any amendments on those? Okay, sensing there's no amendments. Members, sure. What's your pleasure then? So are we good? Okay, I think we're ready.
Can I just have-
Yeah, why don't you close it up here?
Oh, thanks. One thing I failed to mention, Mr. Chairman, I did have LSO research and make sure this only goes into effect for marriages after July 1st, 2023. So anyone in Wyoming who did get married before 18 or their marriage is not automatically voided. So
There you
just
go.
for that protection on anyone who lives in Wyoming who's married doesn't have to worry about reapplying for marriage license, et cetera.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Members, are you ready to vote?
Yes.
Okay, question being called. Ms. Jeffrey, please call the roll call on House Bill 7. No amendments.
Representative Bear,
No.
Representative Byron,
Aye.
Representative Locke. Representative Northrup,
Aye.
Representative Oakley,
Aye.
Representative Storer,
Aye.
Representative Strock,
No.
Representative Zwanitzer,
Aye.
Chairman Harshman.
Aye.
The vote. 6 ayes, 3 noes. Passes.
Very good. It's 9:52. We're going to recess the meeting till Thursday. The bill that we did not hear will be scheduled not for Thursday, but for a later date. Okay, and I'll work with Smith Jeffrey on that. Anything else, members, for the committee? Okay, thank you all for being here and have a lovely day. Beautiful Tuesday.